Hey guys, in this lesson we'll examine changes in exchange rates. Changes in exchange rates impact cash flows for economic actors. We want to explain why these changes occur and, more importantly, predict when they will occur. Remember, the exchange rate is the price of a currency. Just like anything else, the price of a currency is determined by supply and demand. So let's first take a look at the demand for a currency. We'll take the U.S. perspective. In our graph, we show the U.S. demand for Mexican pesos. The quantity of pesos at various prices is represented on the x-axis. The price of pesos in U.S. dollars is represented on the y-axis. The U.S. demand for pesos is downward sloping because economic actors in the U.S. are willing and able to buy more pesos at a lower price or at a lower exchange rate. In other words, it does not take as many dollars to obtain the required number of pesos when pesos are worth less. They are willing and able to buy fewer pesos at a higher exchange rate. In other words, it takes more dollars to obtain the required number of pesos when pesos are worth more. At $1, we intersect the demand curve further to the right on the x-axis, or the quantity axis, than at $5. All right, let's now take a look at the Mexican supply of pesos. Our graph shows the supply schedule. At a high exchange rate, when the value of the peso is high, economic actors from Mexico, individual people and firms, more readily exchange their pesos for dollars in order to buy U.S. goods. In other words, they supply more pesos to be traded for dollars. At a lower exchange rate, when the value of the peso is low, individuals and firms from Mexico supply fewer pesos to be traded for dollars. Their pesos buy fewer dollars. This also implies that Mexicans will buy fewer goods and services from the U.S. More pesos are supplied at $5 than at $1. I did want to take a moment to address the supply of a currency. This notion can seem a little confusing at first. Like any other good or service, supply is associated with selling something. In our example, people sell pesos or exchange them for dollars or trade them for dollars. If we can think about currency supply in this way, it helps us reason through situations just a little bit more easily. Okay, so if we combine the supply and demand graphs, this tells us the equilibrium exchange rate, or the exchange rate that will prevail, in this case, $3. So the exchange rate at any given time is determined by supply and demand, but several factors can cause the supply and demand curves to move. In a floating exchange rate system, these curves can move often. Inflation, interest rates, income, government intervention or controls, and expectations can all result in changes in supply and demand, and thus the resultant exchange rate. Let's first examine how inflation in one country can impact the exchange rate. So first of all, let's talk about what inflation is. Inflation is another word for rising prices in a country. Things are getting more expensive. If we continue with our example, if the rate of inflation, or the rate of the increase in prices, rises in the U.S., people in the U.S. are going to look somewhere else to buy their stuff. In our example, they are going to look to Mexico. The U.S. demand for Mexican goods will increase. So there will be an increase in the U.S. demand for pesos in order to buy those goods from Mexico. Notice this will cause an increase in the exchange rate because the demand curve now intersects the supply curve higher up and further to the right. At the same time, rising prices in the U.S. will reduce the willingness and ability for Mexican consumers to buy U.S. products. Mexican consumers will therefore supply fewer pesos to be exchanged for dollars to buy U.S. goods. In other words, Mexicans are not going to want to sell as many pesos for dollars. They aren't going to want to trade as many pesos for dollars to buy the more expensive U.S. goods. The reduced supply of pesos is shown as a leftward shift in the supply curve. Notice the reduced supply of pesos also increases the exchange rate because the supply curve now intersects the demand curve further up and to the left. So now let's examine the impact of relative or nominal interest rates. Let's see what happens if the U.S. experiences a rise in interest rates relative to Mexico. Investors want higher returns, and they can get higher returns where interest rates are higher. Investors in the U.S. would likely move money from Mexico back home. So they would convert their pesos to dollars. They would reduce their demand for pesos. This is shown as a leftward shift in the demand curve and a corresponding decrease in the exchange rate. Mexican investors want higher returns too. They will also want to move money to the U.S. They will want to sell their pesos to buy dollars in order to invest in the U.S. In other words, they supply more pesos in exchange for dollars. This is shown on the graph as a rightward shift in the supply curve and a further decrease in the exchange rate. If Mexico experiences higher interest rates, the opposite occurs. People want to move money to Mexico. U.S. demand for pesos increases, while Mexican supply of pesos in exchange for dollars decreases. The rightward shift in demand and the leftward shift in supply both increase the value of pesos or the exchange rate for pesos. A note on real interest rates. We'll cover this more later on in the course as well. Real interest rates are nominal interest rates minus inflation. So real interest rates combine the effects of inflation and nominal interest rates we just took a look at. All else equal, a high real interest rate in the U.S. compared to other countries will tend to increase the dollar's value. All right, we have seen that changes in inflation and interest rates impact both the supply and demand for currencies. The effect of income on exchange rates is a little more straightforward. Increases in income in a country can impact the number of goods it can import from other countries. If income in the U.S. rises, people in the U.S. can import more from Mexico. People in the U.S. will need pesos in order to import or buy the additional goods from that country. In other words, the demand for pesos will increase. The demand curve will shift to the right and the exchange rate will increase. An increase in income in the U.S. does not impact the supply of pesos in Mexico. There is no change in the supply curve of pesos, no change in the supply curve. Okay, so we'll address government intervention in more detail in a later lesson. Regarding expectations, a currency's value or its exchange rate relative to another will tend to increase when people think it will appreciate. At the same time, a currency's value will tend to decrease when people think it will depreciate.